Best soldering tools. Besides the equipment, you also need certain tools to perform soldering. These tools are responsible for preparing the materials before soldering and cleaning the surface after the process. Here is a complete list of tools that are involved in the soldering process. 1. Solder. Solder is the filler material that melts and joins the two materials. The rule of thumb is that it should have a lower melting point than the materials to be joined. Only then the solder will melt first and bond the materials. The solders come with and without lead. Based on the materials you are soldering, you have to choose the solder with a lower melting point. 2. Solder flux. The solder flux is a chemical agent that is used to clean the surface of the metals that are to be joined. You can solder without applying flux, but the joints might not be strong and can be broken easily. The flux removes the oxides formed on metal surfaces and prevents further oxidation. This strengthens the soldering joints. You can apply the flux using your hands or a brush, but for mass soldering works, there are different techniques you can adopt for applying the flux. 3. Solder flux pen. A solder flux pen is used to apply flux on the metal surface before the soldering process. The main advantage of using a flux pen is that you can apply the flux only in areas where you are going to solder. This is especially useful while soldering PCBs. Using a flux pen is pretty easy. First, you have to depress the tip of the pen to saturate its flux. Then press the tip against the areas where you will solder the electronic components to apply the solder. 4. Solder seal wire connectors. A solder seal wire connector is shaped in the form of a small tube and is used to join wires. The connector has solder at both of its ends. When you heat the connector using a lighter or small heat gun, the solder melts and flows through the disjoined wires. Once the solder solidifies, it creates a joint between the wires. 5. Solder tips. The tip of the soldering iron that heats and melts the solder is known as a solder tip. It is generally made of a copper core, as copper is a good conductor of heat. It is coated with iron or nickel. The solder tips come in different shapes, with each shape more suited for a specific type of soldering. 6. Soldering wick. Soldering wick is a type of desoldering tool that is made of intertwining copper wires together. When you place the tip of the soldering wick and heat it, the wick will melt the solder and absorb it. Once a portion of the soldering wick is covered with solder, you will have to remove the part. Repeat the process until you remove all the solder. 7. Solder paste. The solder paste is used in PCB assembly for soldering the electronic components. It is made of minute solder spheres held together by solder flux. To apply the solder paste, you have to use a stencil or other techniques. The solder paste is only applied to areas where you need to solder. 8. Solder sucker. Also known as a desoldering pump, it is used to remove solder from PCBs. Some desoldering pumps come with a soldering iron. If not, you have to get an iron separately and heat the solder before using this pump to draw the solder. The pump has a bowl at one end. You have to squeeze the pump and place the other end on the solder. Now when you release the bowl, it will draw the solder. Some models also come with a piston instead of a bowl. Pushing and releasing the piston draws the solder.